and we'll just take it away from here. Yes, my name is Kathy Bagwell, in case you missed that earlier. And I always like to start with a quote. And my first quote is, "A garden without trees scarcely deserves to be called a garden." And that was said by Henry Ellicombe. Just a little history about Henry. He's a British writer who wrote a lot about Shakespeare's gardens and the contents of his gardens, among other books. So he's well known in the horticulture community, at least those who follow the history. Then we have this one, which is a Greek proverb: as society grows greater, when old men plant trees whose shade they know they shall never sit in. And then, of course, we've got the advice from a tree, because you really can't have a garden, shade garden that is, without trees. So the tree says, stand tall and proud, go out on a limb, remember your roots, drink plenty of water, be content with your natural beauty, and enjoy the view. And it's always great to sit in the shade on a cool summer evening, not a hot one, but a cool summer evening. I'm not sure how comfortable this would be, but I would bet it's cool. Now, just moving on, 7.4 is the average soil pH in Sedgwick County. And with that in mind, we'll move on to other things that the plant needs. And this is probably something you learned back in 3rd or 4th grade: sun, air, soil, and water. But of course, with shade plants, there are a few restrictions. And of course, as we become more familiar with plants and their needs, we find that the soil also has a lot of restrictions, one of which was the pH. So what is pH? Well, it is the measure of acidity or alkalinity, and a lot of that is dependent upon the concentration of hydrogen ions that are in the soil. And you notice there that it says about a 5.5 to an 8.0 is that ideal pH for plant growth. Now for grass alone, we want to narrow that pH range to a 6.2 to a 7.0. So if you venture into that acidic range, your grass isn't going to do as well. And the further down you go, the more weeds you're going to get. Same with the on the alkaline side. If you get really high on the pH scale, it's going to be negative for your plant's growth. And then, of course, if you become very alkaline, it looks just exactly like it does on the very acidic end of the spectrum here. So in general, we want to keep it between 5.5 and 7. It can go up over 7, as most of Sedgwick County is a 7.4, and some ends of the county are a little higher. Just from experience, I've learned that Andover and Rose Hill and those points on the east end are very, very alkaline, whereas we can get a lower pH value on the west end. Not that it's always that way, but that is in general. So among some of the other requirements that we have, shade is not all shade. You know, one shade is not the same as another shade. The shade from a building is not the same as the shade from a tree. So all shades not created equal. As fine gardening put so well, there are many variables, including the season, the time of the day, age of the trees, the density of the trees, the canopy composition, are there many trees overlapping? All of this affects how our plants are shaded. And here's a nice little illustration about how the size of the tree can affect the shade of what's below and to the side of the shade of those trees. Notice the further to the right, the denser it gets. Of course, these, what they've illustrated, are fairly small trees. We find that as trees get older, they stop growing upwards as high, but they begin growing outwards more and producing more shade. So degrees of shade and moisture, the handout that was included in the email that gave you the link to hit in order to join this session has plants that have these icons to help you in determining kind of where they fall into. And of course, most of them have a lot of overlap between light shade or mostly sun to full sun. This is one that would probably be closer to 6 hours of sun. And then the top line, the light shade, about a little over 4 hours of sun. And then medium shade is 2 to 4 hours of sun. And full shade, of course, has little or no direct sun. And then on the moisture side, we go with low moisture, medium moisture, or consistent high moisture. So those are the categories. Now, February 16th, 2021, that was this year, we hit a new low at a -17. And the previous record, as you can see on your screen, was a -6 in 1903. That's a long time ago. -17 is outside our normal range of and zone that the plants are used to growing in. So you're going to notice this year some things happen to our plants that haven't happened in a while. And we'll get into some of that as we go along. One thing I've noticed is I have a couple rose bushes that they're a shrub rose. They're not anything more elaborate than that, but they have died back almost to the ground. My Nandinas have died back to the ground. So those are things that we're going to notice here for a while. I have a southern magnolia tree. Well, a lot of those leaves turn brown long before that it's going to drop those leaves. Normally it does that in late May, but they're already starting to drop. So we've speeded up a few things here in the process. This is a map of Kansas showing our USDA hardiness zones is what they call these. And on the bottom, you notice there's a 6A and a 6B. 6A is a little colder, so that's going to be up actually above McPherson, all the way up almost to the state line of Nebraska. -5 to -10 is 6A. 6B is from 0 to -5. Well, our -17 goes into the 5A category, well above what it normally does. Now, this map is calculated based on the temperatures between the years of 1976 and 2005. So They take 30 years essentially and average the coldest temperatures and then come up with the average for the zone. And they change that on a rolling, I think it's every 10 years. But over the years, this map has changed drastically, where not so much of the state of Kansas used to be in zone 6 or even 6B. It used to be more in zone 5. So that has changed over the years. As a result, we can add more plants that used to not be hardy here, but you do so with the understanding that these temperatures might just not be the most accurate. I mean, there are exceptions to every rule. Okay, another thing that I would like you to do when you buy plants is to take a look at the tab, the tag that comes with the plant, or should be on the plant when you buy it. And you notice there's light, it says part sun, morning sunlight only. Now they don't tell us what this particular tag was for, what plant it was for, but these are the types of information you're going to find on every tag. Here's another one. We go down to cold hardiness, where it says 0 to minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's zone 6. Now this particular tag tells us both the degrees of cold hardiness and the zone. Sometimes they don't do that. In this particular plant, it says needs midday shade, where summertime temperatures are above 95. So it gives you a lot of information, and that's information that's good to know when you buy plants. Here's another one that shows the cold hardiness, and it doesn't give us the zone, but it tells us, well, it's not hardy below 40 degrees. And that tells me this is a type of plant that's an annual only. So keep in mind when you're buying plants exactly how long it's going to last. If you want something that comes back year after year, that would be a perennial. So what is shade? Well, we kind of talked about it a little bit before when we showed the different icons that I used on that handout that you should have. By the way, it is in the chat room also. So, you know, if you didn't get it before, you can get it there. Any site that receives less than 6 hours of direct light is considered shade. So light shade, fescue can still grow. However, as soon as you start getting under 4 to 6 hours of sun, fescue grass cannot grow very well. And if you see your grass dying out, then it could be because there's too much shade. I have a neighbor who swears that it should get more than 4 to 6 hours of sun in her shady area, but she can't grow any grass there. And I've just mentioned to her once or twice that it could be that you need to raise the canopy of that tree in order to allow more light in, but she continues to want to do what she wants to do, which is her prerogative. So medium shade is where you have a lot of dappled sun. Medium shade, I would consider, most trees have medium shade, but full shade has little or no direct sun. This is a forest where you see a lot of tree leaves that have dropped onto the floor of the forest. And because all the tree leaves are a light green, it's a spring day. The leaves are still coming out. They're not as dark a green as what they will become, But this is how nature replenishes the soil with compost. If you don't leave the leaves on your shade garden area, which most people don't want to, and that's okay, then you need to replace that with compost of some kind or another. So you can see that all these leaves will help the soil, and it's really the soil that grows the plant, as well as the light and the sun and the water. So in shade, we're less dependent on flowers giving us a lot of variety. What's more important in shade is to use a lot of foliage colors, a difference in texture, a lot of patterns. So all these things go into making shade look nice. Here's one instance where the foliage varies. You see some coral bells coming in here. Just about every other plant, and then they mix in some. Here's a darker one, and then here's it's probably a lamium. So they're alternating plants all the way up and down this sidewalk. Plus they're allowing these plants to grow over part of the sidewalk to make it softer rather than a hard edge there. And here we're getting a lot of textures. You see some textures where, here we go. We have some blades coming up that are fairly tall. We have some oriental lilies growing here. We've got some broadleaf plants here in the back that are probably tropical. Here we've got some dark colored shrub with a lot of yellow leaves or flowers, I should say. So you're seeing a variety of things here, and this makes for a good shade garden. The color, the texture, the form, all plays a role in this garden. Here's another instance where we've got trees in the background, and it could be a south-facing area. And then we have a lot of ground cover way in the back, and we have ground cover here in the front. The type of a good garden in shade has a lot of layering. A good garden in sun also has a lot of layering, where you start out with something that is very low growing, like the ground covers on the right, and then you go to some medium size of plants, and then on the right you go to the shrubs, and then behind it all, of course, are the trees. By adding a path through there, you're not only keeping people and animals off of some of the other areas, but you're also lighting the dark shade that might otherwise be a little too dark. There's some ground cover. It looks like there's some Canadian ginger here on the left and the right, but you see these blocks of stone as a path all the way through, and that can be, doesn't have to be concrete. It could be just about anything you want it to be. It could even be gravel or just light mulch. And then you have the shrubs here on the side, and you can see shrubs all the way through here. Now, one adaptation here in shade is that the leaves get very big. They're thinner, but they're very big in order to help photosynthesize better and to keep the plant growing correctly. And then if you want, you can fill in the gaps with some annuals. And here we see some begonias, we see some impatiens, and behind that some coral bells and some lamium, and of course hostas over on the side. And of course the stone that's used in making this wall is a lighter color to help lighten that shade area. So we're moving on now to some of the shrubs that are in your handout. These are the deciduous shrubs that we're going to start with. And you want to use the shrubs as a backbone in shade. Of course, you've got to have the trees, but shrubs are very important. And as you look back, you see some, what may be some azaleas in the back and some other shrubs that don't need as much sun as what they would in a full sun garden. One of the first plants, I really enjoy having Abelia, which is a nice plant, nice shrub to put in shade. This is a fairly young one. When they get older, I like to raise up the bottom so that it's easier to get leaves out from underneath there. This one is called Edward Goucher. It'll have pink flowers and a little bit of fragrance with it. But this one doesn't start blooming until June, but then it blooms all the way until the first freeze. It's a nice plant, beautiful shape on its own, but you have to keep that shape. You will probably need to prune it once a year at minimum. Here's another Abelia. This one's called Kaleidoscope, in which you get a lot of different multicolored leaves. Fast grower, moderately growing shrub that grows in zone 6A through 9B. And this one has the white flower. It doesn't get as big as some of the other Abelia shrubs. This one, though, you do not want to put it in full sun. It can handle maybe a morning of sun, but not a full day. A full day would just bleach out the leaves for one, and you wouldn't enjoy it near as much. And sometimes it just turns them to a brown color. They get burnt fairly easily, especially these variegated ones. Black chokeberry. This is one that doesn't look particularly beautiful while it's growing in the spring. Summer, it'll have some white flowers, and then in the fall, it'll have some red berries. But this is the beautiful fall color that it brings with it, is the darker pink. And actually, this is really a poor photo. It's more of a red. Well, this one is probably closer to what it really is. It's kind of a rusty red, along with the black berries there. The berries, the birds love to eat. I wouldn't try it myself. The Redosier Dogwood, also known as red twig dogwood, these come from keeping these twigs or limbs at a young state. As soon as they start getting older and getting more gray, which they will turn, then you trim them up and take them out. I've known other people who just cut it all way back every spring down to about a foot level, and that works as well. Fact is, that keeps it more evenly the one color. Now we have yellow twig dogwoods, gray dogwoods, and other colors, but the yellow and the red twigs definitely need to be constantly pruned once a year in the fall or late winter, actually. This one is called the Japanese Kerria shrub. This particular picture is of one that is variegated. However, you can buy Japanese Kerria that don't have the variegation with it. But every year in the spring, during the Easter time, they're blooming, which is how they got the name Easter rose. This particular shrub is long blooming. It'll bloom for about 6 weeks, which makes it easy to hit that Easter time frame. Oak leaf hydrangea. This one's called Alice. A nice, you see the color that the leaves are turning to in the fall. And the oak leaf hydrangea is the only member of that hydrangea family that will develop fall foliage colors. And of course, the blooms on this are interesting to a lot of butterflies and bees. This one is called, this is another oak leaf hydrangea, and I limited my talk to oak leaf hydrangeas because they're the easiest hydrangeas to grow. You don't have to be real careful about when to prune it as you do some of the other ones as well. This one, ruby slippers, it starts out with white flowers, then they turn pink, and then they turn to that rosy red, which is how it got its name. The foliage does turn burgundy in the fall. It grows up to about 4 feet. This one gets wider rather than taller. You know, most oak leaf hydrangeas can get to the 8 to 10 feet range otherwise. But this is a special one that was hybridized to create that dwarf form. The St. John's wort or Hypericum, the blooms appear in June and sometimes will hang around into July, but they don't produce any nectar. So you don't see this as helping out a lot of bees and butterflies, but it does perform very well and it's a nice bloomer. This again is a fairly young shrub. They will get huge if you let them, but you can always prune them back to the size you want them to be, or actually a little shorter than you want them to be, and then they grow back within the year. This is a deciduous shrub called the Virginia Sweetspire. This particular one is Little Henry, which is a little larger than, actually it's a little smaller than the other Henry Sweetspire. But this shows you how beautiful the flowers can be. And this one, if you give it a half day of shade, it's quite happy. Although I've seen it put in full sun for the most part. The one thing you do have to remember about this shrub though, is that if you're in clay soil, it's going to become chlorotic, where the leaves, you'll see the veins darker than the rest of the leaf. And I think you might be able to see it right here on some of these leaves that are sticking up here. I've had customers who didn't want me to put any sulfur on them, but I said, well, it's going to take care of that chlorotic problem. And eventually I went ahead and just put it on there, and the shrub then will survive. Otherwise, it gets smaller and smaller and eventually dies. This is Henry's Garnet. This is the one that's larger. The Sweetspire is one that will sucker. So you want to put it in a place where if it suckers, it's not going to matter. But this is the great fall color, and that's pretty true to form with all the Sweetspires. They are just barely hardy through this zone 6. So they may have gotten bit really hard with our freeze, just letting you know. Winter jasmine. I have one of these that started with one gallon pot. I planted it and it's gotten to the point where it's about 8 feet wide. And of course I trim it down so that, you know, all the stragglers aren't showing up above on the top. And so it stays about 4 feet high. But you see what it looks like. Mine started blooming in February, and then of course, and then that was before the 16th of February. Then it never recovered after that to bloom again. So this is one that, although it survived quite nicely, I think the stems always have a green look to them until after that freeze, and then they turn brown. However, they're putting on leaves, so there's no fragrance, but it can be quite beautiful when it's blooms in the spring. Now, some quick evergreen shrubs. A lot of these shrubs are some of those that are not extremely common. The Aucuba, gold dust, these are kind of like your hollies in that the plant is either a male or a female. So when you buy one of these, it's not going to produce any berries because there's no cross-pollination there. But it is quite beautiful. It did get bit really hard on the February 16th freeze. You trim it back and it just regrows. However, it's a slow grower, so it takes a while for it to recover. A leatherleaf viburnum is very versatile. It can perform and create flowers in both shade and full sun. Fact is, in full sun, I've had customers who wanted them in full sun to block out the view of their neighbors. They will get up to about 15 feet high if you let them. And there's no problem in doing that. It's just when they get that big, then I start limbing them up a little bit on the bottom just to make them look nicer. And they do quite well. Very, very hardy shrubs. Fact is, these will grow in clay, in loam, and sandy soils, so you don't have to worry about what kind of soil you have with these. Oregon grapeholly. There are two forms. The aquifolium is the bigger form, which you see here. It will grow between, depending on the variety, between 2 feet and 10 feet. The repens, Mahonia repens, is the one that stays very, very low. I have some of those in a garden under a tree, and those only get about 1 foot tall, but they are blooming right now, and they're going to put on some nice berries. Purple, actually they're a blueberry, and they don't last very long because the birds love to eat them up. Nandina was one that I mentioned before about getting bitten by that hard freeze that we had on February 16th. Taller forms include the heavenly bamboo, which is what is shown here. These will bloom. They put on berries. Birds apparently don't like the berries, so when those berries fall to the ground, and after a while you may want to trim them off, but when they fall to the ground, they'll bloom, or not bloom, but they'll sprout and grow more Nandina. The heavenly bamboo doesn't sucker very much. Neither does the plum passion, which is a little darker color in foliage. But some of your smaller varieties that are very low growing will sucker quite a bit. This particular one is called Firepower, and that is the winter color. And it usually takes until mid-December before it actually gets to that color. But it's very beautiful until it starts greening up about this time of year. This one is called Firepower. It does not bloom. It does not put on seeds. And I have never seen it sucker. There may be some exceptions, but I have not ever seen this one sucker. Some of the other smaller forms, which are smaller than this one gets about 2 feet wide and up to 3 feet tall. But then we get freezes every once in a while that knock it back down to a smaller size, and I trim it up and let it grow again. Yews are another plant that grow very well in shade. You see this particular type of yew has red berries on it. The Hicks yew is an upright form, although you will probably need to trim it lightly from time to time, especially across the top. It grows kind of in a V shape, so that the bigger it gets, the further out it goes. This is one that if you let it go, it'll get up to 20-some feet high. So you may want to trim it up a little bit from time to time. Here's one that comes in a Christmas tree shape called the Capitata yew. And this one, is very soft to the touch, looks very nice. It holds that form, that shape, does very well. You may have to trim it from time to time, but not very often. And this is just a close-up of a branch of what the yews look like. Backside is a little more silvery and light than the front side, but it shows you what their berries look like. And we'll get into some of the perennials. And again, some of the perennials I included here are some that aren't always the norm, although some of them are more in the norm than others. This one is the Ajuga. On the left is the chocolate chip, and on the right's the bronze beauty in bloom. And they do have a nice little stalk. Once that stalk finishes blooming, usually it dries up and doesn't look very good, so you may want to trim it off a little bit. These are not native to the US, but that's not a problem. They do spread very rapidly. And if they start getting overabundant and growing on top of each other, then usually they'll kill each other off over the winter and kill off some of the plants. So it's just one of those things that you need to be aware of. On the left here is the black scallop. I've seen this in gardens. It is very, very dark. Less purple than black. Actually, this photo doesn't do it real justice, but it darkens your shade, which is already fairly dark. On the right is Burgundy Glow, and this one I've not had a whole lot of success, even though they're very hardy plants. In general, the Burgundy Glow I tend to have less success with than any of the other varieties. Astilbe is a good looking shade plant that brings a lot of color into a darker shade area. And that's where you want to put it, is in the darker shade. This particular one, you notice, has kind of a chartreuse type of foliage down below. Not all Astilbes are that light in color. On the right is what the native form looks like. And it has the white flowers that are very different from what the Chinese flowers are on the left. So that kind of gives you a little idea. The native flowers here to the US on the astilbe occur in like North Carolina, in that area. So you really, it's a southern area, and they just don't grow in forests in Kansas. Here's another one of the astilbes, color flash lime. These plants, as I mentioned, you want to keep them in the fairly dark part of shade, because with the heat we get here in summertime, they will go summer dormant if they get any amount of sun whatsoever. And when they go dormant, then you never know if they're going to come back the next year or not. So, I mean, they have beautiful flowers, but once those flowers fade, they fade to a tan, which isn't quite so beautiful. And that's when you may want to trim them off and just have the foliage there for the rest of the season. This is a map that if you go to plants.usda.gov and put in the name of your plant that you're wanting to find out if it has a native range here in the US, it will show you with this color of green exactly where it's native to. And so you see here, we've got some Tennessee and some West Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina as being the native range to that one astilbe that I showed you that was the native plant. Spotted Beebalm. Now there are many varieties of Beebalm, and some are very colorful, and those are the ones that come from China and Asia. This particular one is native to Arkansas, Spotted Beebalm, and that comes because you see some of these little petals have spots on them. And this plant will throw out these colored leaves down below, and then these flower parts, and then they'll grow a new set of leaves that will turn to this pink color, and then you'll have more, and they just stack upon each other, and therefore they have a very long bloom season. And my fingers got a little heavy on that, so we went right on to the next slide, which is what I call the Monarda or Beebalm that we typically find in garden centers, and that's the one that thrives in moderate to wet areas. It does have some natives in Missouri and other areas north and east of Missouri, so we're not that far away. These will sucker, send some rhizomes out and create more plants. Occasionally you have to thin them, otherwise they don't ever bloom once they get too thick. And of course, once they bloom, they start dying from the top down. And so you end up having to remove the stalks eventually, because they just don't look very pretty. The lungwort, and I see all over the internet that Bethlehem sage is a common name for lungwort. Pulmonaria is the scientific name for this. This particular variety is silver shimmers, and they've got that silvery leaf with just a green edge on it and the green vein down the middle. But I don't know anyone in the horticultural area that calls it Bethlehem sage. I'm not sure where that name came from, but I'm going to be calling it lungwort, or pulmonaria. This one does grow in shade. However, keep it away from walnuts because it doesn't grow well under walnut trees. It just doesn't. And there's a lot of hydrangeas that don't either. Here's one that's very pretty, and the flowers will change color over time. They start out with the pink, and then they get to be more of the raspberry and purple. They do bloom early in the spring, This photo is from Dave's garden, as you can maybe just barely make out on your screen. They do need afternoon shade. I know the person who named this as Lungwort was a doctor who also dabbled in botany, and he says, well, you know, this looks like diseased lung. So that's how that name came about. But again, I don't know how the Bethlehem sage came about. Bleeding hearts. Now there's a couple forms of bleeding hearts. As always, there's more than one kind. This one is called the old-fashioned pink. Scientific name is Dicentra spectabulis. Typically, this one goes summer dormant in this area if it's not in deep shade where it's kept really cool and moist. The Dicentra eczema, which is a little taller, you know, almost are like peonies. They're that shrubby. And that particular pink of the bleeding hearts are a little on the faded side. But here's one that is real beautiful. Notice that the Dicentra eczema has a different leaf than what the leaves of the last flower, the old-fashioned spectabulis one is. Notice these have deep lobes, but they're a big leaf, whereas this one's more of a fern leaf appearance. And sometimes you can get these to repeat bloom. These will not go summer dormant if you've got it in enough shade. Now, the other one that I mentioned, you know, the old-fashioned pink, this one is, if you're far enough north like Topeka or Kansas City, they won't go summer dormant there if you've got it located properly. So anyway, I recommend, of course, going with the Dicentra eczema, which doesn't go summer dormant here. And it'll also repeat bloom on occasion. The blue wood aster. This is a fast growing plant, prefers some afternoon shade if you can give it. It will naturalize, it does spread very quickly. Doesn't like overly moist soils, but it does like somewhat moist. So, you know, there's a fine line between just moist and overly moist. But this is the blue shade, which is more of a lavender, and they come in other pinks as well, or white. Now the Threadleaf Bluestar is pretty much a plant that will handle full sun, but if you get it in half sun, half shade, you're okay. It does tend to get a little floppy if you give it any kind of shade, but these flowers come out in May timeframe. They put on quite the show, and then the plant keeps growing after it flowers. And so you'll notice that when the flowering's done, it will produce some seeds, but then it keeps growing bigger and bigger. And I find that the ones I have only get a half day of sun. So if I cut those back about halfway after it's done flowering, they'll still grow, but they don't get nearly as huge as what they would otherwise. Now they'll double in width just about every year. And these were found in the mountains of Arkansas. These have a beautiful fall color. It's this buttery looking yellow, almost better than having some grasses. You see some maiden grasses here in the background and some other trees and shrubs in the background, but this is a beautiful color. And then, of course, I leave it on to catch more snow in the winter time, and then late winter is when I cut them back and wait on them to get started growing. They're already about 4 inches tall. Okay, Bowman's root. This particular plant is a native plant, has white flowers, although I've seen a variety that has come out, which of course is a cultivar of this, has pink flowers. But this is one that likes a little drier area to grow in, doesn't like to be, really wet. And this one you find in the deep forest of a forest, which of course, because of the canopy, the rain doesn't get down to the floor, so it's drier. One thing you need to be aware of when you have shade plants that are under trees is just how much rain gets through that tree. So kind of pay attention, and those plants may need supplemental watering from time to time. And here's the fall color of that plant. Isn't that great? That's a burgundy color for the most part. Bugbane, or the Actaea simplex. This is a Japanese plant. We've cultivated it and made various varieties. Typically, they have either dark green foliage or a burgundy foliage. They'll come out darker in color, and then as the summer goes along, it lightens up a little bit. It can handle very wet soils, but doesn't have to. However, if it's kept too dry, it doesn't like that. It kind of dies on you when it's in too light of moisture. This is the native form of the Actaea. This is very tall, very big leaves, and of course it likes it wet. So this one flowers in July and August, grows to be about 7 feet tall with the flowers. And I think the estimate on 24 to 36 inches wide is probably a little on the light side. I think it'll probably get wider as it grows longer. This one is Brunnera, which you'll see why it's considered a variety of forget-me-nots. This one came from Siberia, believe it or not. Blooms in late spring. Probably not as late as you might think. It's already bloomed now. It blooms pretty much in late March. Prefers some moisture and rich soil, so I wouldn't put it in the worst area. It likes to have that humus and a lot of tree leaves and compost added in there. This one, I planted these in a customer's little forest area, and over time you would see the variety that's not variegated pop up from seed from this one. So be aware that this one will produce seeds that drop, but it won't come back in this form. Columbine, those are starting to get pretty big now. I've got some that are 6 inches tall or more. The Aquilegia canadensis is the form that is native to this part of North America. Handles all soils, rich to poor. It can handle a great deal of sun, although I try to give it a little bit of shade at the hottest part of the day, but it produces seeds that drop, and they just like to grow where they land. So there are many colors in with the European varieties that are just as good for your bees and butterflies. Coral bells, believe it or not, started from this particular species of Heuchera americana. They like a little bit of sun, slightly acidic soil, and mulch them really well in wintertime because they tend to come up out of the ground with their roots. And when they do that, then they don't survive very well. The website I got a lot of these photos from in the past is called heucheras.com. It no longer exists, so I'm not sure what happened to that website. Here's some more coral bells, Blondie and Lime, and Red Lightning. You know, coral bells is one of those that they come up with new varieties every year and new color patterns every year. So it's hard to keep up with these. And here's the Cajun Fire, which is a dark red form, Peach Melba. There's another one called Butterscotch that's pretty similar, you know, and there's several that have that kind of yellowish tan look to them. Moving on to Crested Iris. This particular one usually has 3 individual flowers all attaching in a single point there. Needs afternoon shade. It does quite well with morning sun, but it likes some well-drained, rich soil, and it, just like regular iris, likes to have part of the bulbs laying out of the soil above the soil level. Tiarella, I always think of this as a relative to Heuchera, even though there's no relative in their background. This one also needs full part shade to full shade and moist, rich soil. It's good if you don't put it under trees that are very heavy in roots, such as maples and southern magnolias. They just don't compete with the roots very well. Okay, I'm going to quickly go through the hostas because we're just about out of time. They come in many sizes and forms, and these are the 5 main categories that the Hosta Society uses to categorize all the different hostas. This is just a combination of what one online retail service has for hostas, and the variety. What it shows is the variety of colorations that you can have, anywhere from almost all white to reddish leaves and so on. It's amazing what they can do with the genetics, and this one changes very rapidly as well. It's hard to keep up with all the new hostas that come out every year. But here are just a few hostas that I like. The Remember Me is one that has the variegation down the center of the leaf. The Patriot has the variegation along the outside edges. Chartreuse Wiggles, very light colored. It would brighten up your shade, but those leaves are so different from anything else that I've seen that it's very unusual. Red October, there's very few plants or very few hostas that get the red stems, and even fewer that have red leaves. But we've got one that does have red leaves, and that's this one called First Blush. That's as red as it gets. Yeah, it might get a little more red as it gets older, but Oak Creek Grower had this photo online for us. Some of the hosta facts that you need to be aware of. It's best if the hostas get a little bit of sun. And of course, it varies depending on the variety that you have. In general, the lighter the color, the more sun it needs. but if you give it afternoon sun in this area, it's going to burn the leaves. So you've got to find that fine line that's just enough sun that helps it grow. Best time to plant is in the fall. Second best time is in the spring. Both work real well. Just the fall planting will allow more time for the roots to develop before any heat comes along. Same with the dividing. Fall, 6 weeks before the average freeze date, which is in late October. So, if you're dividing in early September, that should help. Well, at least we have a frost date in late October. Freezing, though, it may be quite a bit later. However, last year we had snow in October, so sometimes that doesn't work. The blue coloring on some of the hostas is due to a waxy coating as that develops more as the foliage matures. The thicker the leaves are, the more slug resistant they become. Leaves are edible. If we ever run out of food in the supermarket, then there's a way to supplement your diet with greens. Once a plant has bloomed, though, it will not produce more leaves. To try not to eat the leaves after it blooms. Indian pinks. This is a native flower that hummingbirds, butterflies, a lot of insects love. It does green up a little later than most in the spring, but it's such a beautiful, colorful flower that it's quite nice. Jacob's ladder. In this photo, it shows about the height of a Jacob's ladder. It gets about 6 inches tall, if you can see that on that ruler. And the leaves are so parallel, it almost looks like the rungs of a ladder that go on the outside of a centerpiece. It does need some well-drained soil. They don't do real well in waterlogged soils. I had one customer that had these in a rock garden, and the rock, because the rock was covering everything, the soil wouldn't dry out fast enough, and they didn't do real well. Lenten roses. This is an evergreen species. It's native to Greece and Turkey. They like the neutral to alkaline soils. They don't mind clay. As I mentioned, they are evergreen. However, our February freeze took care of all the leaves on my plants, but they've come out with new leaves. They like it drier than the average shade plant. Just to let you know, don't water it too much. This one's called Red Lady. And we've got a couple other ones. Gold Bullion, which is popular with some people, and others have seen enough of the chartreuse that they say I'll pass on that one. But Pink Lady is a nice color to have as well. The Virginia, we've got a couple forms here, Winter Glow and Red Beauty. The leaves are evergreen except when it gets to -17, as it did this February. It is a slow grower. They will clump, and normally evergreen during the winter unless it gets extremely low. They do bloom very early in the spring. It's like mid-March in general. However, because of that freeze, mine didn't bloom this spring, and I'm not expecting them to, but we'll see. And here's one of the newer forms called Solar Flare, variegated, has that chartreuse color that some people don't care to see very often. Pink flowers up on top. Same evergreen leaves with the creamy borders. They do get about 10 inches high. 18 inches wide. And with the flowers, they will get a little taller, up to 15. Zones 4 to 9, sun to part shade. They do like to have some sun. I put mine where they get morning sun. Plumbago, this is one that is very versatile of a plant. That's a close-up of the flower. At this time of year, I have a bed of these, and they get half day of sun and then a half day of shade. I've seen some beds in full sun, and they do just fine. This is almost like a subshrub. These stems that you see in the background are very woody, and that's all that's on those beds right now, are those woody shrubby stems. And I just take a lawnmower and run it over that, and that gets them down to a level where it's manageable. But they'll grow all summer, and they start blooming in August. They sometimes finish in September, and sometimes they continue on into October. They do spread slowly. They will go under fences. They do cover the ground quite well. Dogs don't seem to bother them, unlike most plants. So, I mean, it's a very, like I said, it's a versatile plant, and those flowers, if you get to see them at dusk, they really pop. It's an electric blue at that time of day, not this light blue that you see on the screen. And heartleaf skullcap, also known as a scutellaria, is a scientific name. It kind of likes the drier sites, but it's a woodland native. Has been found in Kansas, blooms mid-June to midsummer. Bees and butterflies really enjoy that. And we're going to wrap it up here with wood poppy. Prefers moist, rich soil, so make sure you have plenty of compost around. Handles deep shade very well and still blooms, although it's probably not as much blooming as what it does when it does get some sunlight. I like the name of this website, plantmorenatives.com. Okay, so Master Gardener hotline is up and going, 9 to 12. You can call them directly at this number, 660-0190, or 1 to 4 in the afternoon. Or if you just have a question that you don't care how quick they get to it, send it to sgemghotline@gmail.com, and they'll get back with you usually within the same day, unless you do it overnight. And that they'll help you out with any questions about most things that grow. And then want to wrap it up here with a different kind of flower bed. As it says, it's a place to dream. Anyway, interesting little flower bed there. So, despite the gardener's best intentions, nature will improvise. So thanks, and we'll open it up to questions that you've put in the chat room.
Yes, I have a couple of questions for you. A lot of thank yous coming in. There was a lot of really good information. And for those of you who have been asking, we will have this recorded and we will share it on our library YouTube channel, so you can go back and revisit it, because it was a lot of really great information, and will help with planning your gardens. So when will the Nandinas come back? Did you
if they didn't
that?
die, they should start growing here in late April, early May.
Okay. And then also about Nandinas, imported Nandinas that are non-native, do they, there's a rumor that they have berries that are toxic to birds and shouldn't be planted. Do you know anything about that?
I know the birds don't like the berries. I'm not aware whether they're toxic or not. So I can't help you out on that particular question. I'm sorry.
But could that be something they could mail to the Sedgwick County Master Gardener line?
Absolutely. And Master Gardener hotline would research it and then get back with you. Absolutely.
Okay, can you go back to when you're talking about the corbels and you talked about something that hampered their coming back up? I think we just missed that little word.
What that was about was that during the winter, coral bells have a tendency of coming up out of the ground so that the roots are exposed then to the weather. And when that happens, they don't work very well. I mean, they don't live very well under those conditions. So that's why we want to make sure you put plenty of compost or mulch around them before winter hits. That's what that information was about.
Thank you. Okay, well, that was actually the end of my list of questions. Did anyone else have any others that they wanted to put into the chat while I look back through and make sure I didn't miss anything? Well, I had a question, and this might seem kind of silly from a beginner gardener. How do you tell the alkaline level or the acidity level of your soil?
Okay, good question. Actually, that's not such a bad question after all. Okay. There is a way to take samples of your soil and take it to the extension office and get it evaluated there. And they can then send it back, you know, the results of their testing to you in order to say whether they're alkaline or acidic. And they'll also tell you, especially if you want to create a shade garden, on the form that you submit with your sample of soil, you tell them what you're wanting to do with that area that you took your samples from, and they'll tell you then if you need to add any lime or whether you need to add any sulfur and how much. So they make it real simple. I've used the soil testing service there. I've also used some of the little kits that you can buy in some of the garden centers, and you put a little soil in a little tube, test tube like structure, and then you add a little water, and then you size it up with the scale that's on the back side of the card and all this information came from, and it'll tell you kind of in general, more general terms. It's not as specific, but it is at least in general kind of tells you where you're at.
Okay, and follow up, does your alkaline or acidity level change like in different parts of your yard, or would it be pretty much the same across?
No, it could change from area to area. Just as an example, I had a front yard that was very acidic at one point, but my backyard was very alkaline. So, I mean, it can change, and some of that depends upon what you've done. For example, with the front yard and lawn services and what they've put on it and so on. So it's recommended that you test it every 5 years or so, just to kind of have an idea of what it's doing, if it's getting moving towards one scale end of the scale or the other end of the scale.
Thank you. Well, while we were talking about that, several more questions rolled in. And a follow-up, Nandina berries contain cyanide and are toxic to birds, according to
Okay.
one of our attendees.
Okay.
So what perennials, oh, let's go with this one. How tall does the wood poppy get?
Wood poppy stays in a fairly low form. It probably gets around 12 to 14 inches high.
Okay. And then what perennials would you recommend for a novice gardener?
Novice gardener, I would start out with something like if it's perennials that they're interested in, putting it in some ajuga, and then some other plants such as the bleeding hearts, for example, would be an easy one. Coral bells is fairly easy. So, those are some of the easier ones to just plant and go with.
Thank you. I'll probably use that information myself. So good question.
Yeah.
What are good sources for the plants you mentioned? I'm assuming places to purchase them, maybe?
Yeah, I take it as that was the question there too.
Okay.
There are some online native plant retail outlets that you can buy plants from. However, they charge a premium because of the shipping charges, etc. They give you small plants, and they should have it wrapped in like paper towels, etc., before they put it in a plastic bag and so on. So you may want to check with them. Most of them do a pretty good job of packing the plants in. Some of the like the Arboretum, Dick Arboretum has plant sales. Yeah, I see the comment that came up. Dick Arboretum is a great source for natives. Sometimes they mislabel some of them, but that happens from time to time. But that would be one of the places I'd go for some of the natives.
And then how about, oops, sorry, how about some of the lesser known plants?
I'm sorry,
Are there
plant?
a good place, nursery or garden source for some of the lesser known plants you mentioned?
Well, yeah, it's hard for me to say simply because I buy wholesale, and I get them in by the flat where I have 50 to 72 little plugs there. You probably don't want that many. So that's, there are a few Missouri native plant nurseries that'll ship just a few numbers. And so I would look at some of the Missouri native plant sites online. They would have some information for you and have some of those plants.
Okay. Good deal.